The tiny red light blinked steadily from inside my pill organizer as my daughter Sarah explained to the doctor why I needed to be committed. She spoke about me like I wasn't sitting right there in the examination room, her voice dripping with practiced concern while she listed all the ways I'd supposedly lost my mind. What she didn't know was that for the past 4 months I'd been recording every single conversation, every whispered phone call, every meeting they thought I was too confused to understand. The device was smaller than a breath mint, and it had captured something that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marge Peterson, and at 73 years old, I'm supposed to be the sweet grandmother who bakes cookies and forgets where she put her reading glasses. That's certainly the story my family has been telling everyone for months now. But what they don't realize is that my mind is as sharp as it's ever been, and I've been watching them orchestrate my downfall with the precision of a military operation. It started 6 months ago with small things. Sarah would visit and move my medications around, then act concerned when I couldn't find them. My son David would call and ask me the same questions 3 times in one conversation, then later tell people I was repeating myself. My youngest Michael would rearrange items in my house during his visits, then express worry when I mentioned things weren't where I left them. They were gaslighting me, though I didn't know that term at the time. I just knew something felt fundamentally wrong. I live alone in the same ranch house I've called home for 47 years, ever since my late husband Robert and I bought it as newlyweds in 1977. The neighborhood has changed around me, young families replacing the friends who've moved to assisted living or passed away, but this house still holds every memory that matters. The kitchen where I taught my children to cook, the living room where we opened Christmas presents, the garden where Robert proposed to renew our vows on our 25th anniversary. This isn't just a house, it's the repository of my entire life. Robert died 3 years ago after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. We had been together for 51 years, and losing him felt like losing half of myself. But I grieved, I healed, and I adapted. I learned to live independently again, something I hadn't done since I was 22 years old. I joined a book club, volunteered at the local food bank, and maintained my small circle of close friends. I wasn't just surviving without Robert. I was creating a new chapter of my life that honored his memory while embracing my own strength. That independence apparently threatened my children more than I realized. You see, Robert had been quite successful in his career as a mechanical engineer, and over the decades we had accumulated what most people would consider significant wealth. The house alone is worth nearly $800,000, sitting on 3 acres of prime real estate that developers have been eyeing for years. Add to that Robert's pension, our investments, and the life insurance payout, and my estate totals just over $2 million. When Robert was alive, the children never seemed particularly interested in our finances. They had their own lives, their own careers, their own problems. Sarah worked as a nurse practitioner and lived comfortably with her husband in a suburban development 30 minutes away. David had built a successful accounting practice and owned a beautiful home in the historic district. Michael, the baby at 38, had struggled more financially, jumping between various business ventures and startups that never quite took off, but even he seemed to be finding his footing. Everything changed after the funeral. Suddenly they were all very concerned about my well-being. They wanted to help manage my finances, suggested I might want to downsize, offered to handle my medical appointments. Their attention felt suffocating rather than supportive, but I attributed it to grief and worry. I thought they were processing their father's death by trying to take care of me. I should have recognized the pattern sooner. It began with Sarah questioning my memory during casual conversations. "Mom, didn't you already tell me this story?" she would say when I shared something from my day. "Or are you sure that happened? You mentioned something completely different last week." At first, I second-guessed myself. Maybe I was repeating stories. Maybe grief had affected my memory more than I wanted to admit. Then David started expressing concerns about my driving. He would call and ask if I had driven anywhere that day, then lecture me about the dangers of elderly drivers. He brought up statistics about reaction times and suggested I consider giving up my license voluntarily before something terrible happened. When I protested that I'd never had an accident and passed my last vision test with flying colors, he would sigh heavily and say he was just looking out for me. Michael's approach was different, but equally unsettling. He would visit and spend hours going through old photo albums with me, but his questions felt like tests. "Who is this person, Mom?" he would ask. pointing to pictures of family friends or distant relatives. When I couldn't immediately recall someone's name, he would make a note on his phone and exchange meaningful glances with whichever sibling happened to be present. The three of them began coordinating their visits in a way they never had before. If Sarah stopped by on Monday, David would appear on Tuesday, and Michael would show up Wednesday. They were tag-teaming me, I realized later, each one building on the narrative the previous visitor had established. They were documenting my supposed decline with the thoroughness of researchers conducting a study. The breaking point came during what they called a family intervention. All three children arrived at my house on a Saturday morning in early March, their faces wearing identical expressions of gentle concern that felt practiced and false. They had prepared a presentation, complete with printed materials about memory care facilities and the benefits of assisted living. Sarah took the lead, which didn't surprise me. As the eldest and a medical professional, she had always been the family spokesperson during crises. She sat across from me at my own dining room table and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Mom, we've been talking, and we're all worried about you," she began. "These past few months we've noticed some changes that concern us. You've been forgetting conversations, repeating stories, having trouble with simple tasks. Yesterday Michael found your car keys in the refrigerator." I stared at her, my mind racing. I had not put my car keys in the refrigerator. I was meticulous about where I placed my keys, hanging them on the small hook by the garage door every single time I came home. It was a habit so ingrained that I did it without thinking. But Michael was nodding solemnly, backing up his sister's claim. "We think it might be time to consider some additional support," David chimed in. "Not necessarily moving out of the house right away, but maybe having someone here during the day. Someone who can help with medications, make sure you're eating properly, provide companionship." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out that I was perfectly capable of managing my own life, but something in their coordinated presentation, the way they spoke about me instead of to me, made me pause. This wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush. They had already decided what they believed to be true, and no amount of protest from me was going to change their minds. That night, after they left, I sat in Robert's chair and tried to make sense of what was happening. My children genuinely seemed to believe I was declining, but their evidence felt manufactured. The incidents they described either hadn't happened the way they claimed, or hadn't happened at all. It was as if they were seeing a different version of me than the one who existed. Then I remembered something Robert used to say when he was dealing with difficult clients at work. When someone's story doesn't add up, start keeping track of the facts. He was an engineer, and engineers solve problems with data. If my children were building a case that I was incompetent, I needed to build a counter case with evidence of my own. That's when I decided to start recording. I had learned about digital recording devices from a mystery novel I'd read the previous month. The protagonist was a private investigator who used tiny recording devices to gather evidence of cheating spouses and insurance fraud. It seemed like something from a spy movie, but the author had included enough technical detail to make it seem plausible. I drove to an electronics store in the next town over, somewhere my children wouldn't accidentally see me. The young man behind the counter looked surprised when I asked about small recording devices, but he was helpful and non-judgmental. He showed me several options and explained how they worked. I settled on a device about the size of a large button that could record continuously for up to 12 hours and store weeks of audio. "Are you working on a memoir?" he asked as he rang up my purchase. "Something like that," I replied. Back home, I practiced using the device until I was comfortable with its operation. The recording quality was remarkably clear, and it was virtually silent when running. I could hide it anywhere, and no one would know it was there. I felt like I was preparing for war, and in many ways I suppose I was. I started small, recording conversations during my children's regular visits. At first I was hoping to capture proof that they were wrong about my memory, that I wasn't displaying the signs of dementia they claimed to see. What I discovered was far more disturbing. During Sarah's first recorded visit, she spent 20 minutes rearranging items in my medicine cabinet while I was in the bathroom. When I returned, she was standing in the hallway looking concerned. "Mom, I noticed your medications aren't organized very well," she said. "Some of these bottles were in the wrong places. Are you having trouble keeping track of what you're supposed to take when?" I stared at the medicine cabinet, which had been perfectly organized when I left the room 5 minutes earlier. Now my blood pressure medication was where my vitamins usually sat, and my calcium supplements were mixed in with my prescription bottles. The deliberate nature of the disorganization was obvious to me, but to someone who didn't know better, It would look like the confused arrangement of someone with cognitive issues. I could help you set up a pill organizer, Sarah continued. Something with compartments for each day of the week. It might make things easier for you. I agreed, not because I needed help, but because I wanted to see where this was leading. Sarah returned the following week with an elaborate pill organizer system and spent an hour setting it up. What she didn't know was that the recording device was hidden inside the empty compartment for Sunday evening medications. Over the next month, I captured conversation after conversation that revealed the scope of their plan. They weren't just documenting my supposed decline, they were actively creating evidence of it. David would call and ask me complex questions about financial matters, then get frustrated when I asked him to repeat or clarify something. He would end these calls by saying things like, "I think we really need to consider getting some help with Mom's finances soon." Michael was perhaps the most manipulative. During one recorded visit, he moved my photo albums around, then asked me to show him pictures from specific family events. When I couldn't immediately locate the album he wanted because he had moved it, he shook his head sadly and said, "Mom, you used to be so organized. I'm worried about you."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But the most damning recording came from a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Sarah had arrived for a visit while I was in the garden. She let herself in with the spare key I had given her years ago and immediately called David on her phone. I was heading inside when I heard her voice through the kitchen window. "The pill organizer is working perfectly," she was saying. "Every time I move a few pills around, she gets confused and can't remember if she took them or not. Yesterday she took her blood pressure medication twice because she couldn't remember taking it the first time." My blood ran cold. Sarah was deliberately tampering with my medications, creating a situation where I might accidentally double-dose myself, then using my reasonable confusion as evidence of cognitive decline. "The doctor's appointment is scheduled for next Friday," she continued. "Michael has been keeping a list of all the incidents we've documented, and I've got photos of the disorganized medicine cabinet and the car keys in the refrigerator." Car keys in the refrigerator? They had staged that too. What about the house? David's voice was faint through the phone, but I could make out his words. "Once she's declared incompetent, we can get power of attorney and start the process of selling it. The developer who contacted us last month is still interested. With the three-way split and after paying for her care, we're each looking at probably $400,000 minimum." I stood frozen in my garden, dirt still clinging to my gardening gloves, as my daughter discussed selling my home and splitting the proceeds while I was still alive. They weren't concerned about my health or safety. They were systematically destroying my credibility so they could gain control of my assets. That night, I listened to the recording 3 times, making sure I had heard correctly. There was no ambiguity in Sarah's words. She was poisoning my medications, moving my belongings, and coordinating with her brothers to have me declared mentally incompetent. They had turned my own children into strangers, people willing to gaslight and manipulate their own mother for money. But I had something they didn't know about. I had evidence. Hours and hours of recordings that documented their deception and revealed their true motives. The question was what to do with it. I spent the weekend researching elder abuse laws and the legal requirements for declaring someone incompetent. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. On one hand, their behavior clearly constituted elder abuse, which was a serious crime. On the other hand, the process for declaring someone mentally incompetent was surprisingly easy if multiple family members were willing to testify to a person's declining condition. The doctor's appointment Sarah had mentioned was the next crucial step in their plan. If they could get a medical professional to document cognitive decline, especially if that professional was presented with a list of concerning incidents and witnessed confused behavior, it would give their case significant credibility. I realized I needed to be strategic. Simply confronting them with the recordings wouldn't be enough. They could deny the allegations, claim the recordings were taken out of context, or even argue that my paranoid behavior was further evidence of my declining mental state. I needed to build a stronger case, one that would not only expose their fraud, but protect me from future manipulation. First, I needed allies. I called my longtime friend Helen, who had been Robert's secretary for over 20 years and knew our family well. I invited her over for coffee, and after swearing her to secrecy, played her some of the recordings. Helen's face went through a series of emotions as she listened: confusion, disbelief, and finally outrage. "Marge, this is horrible," she said. How long has this been going on? At least 4 months that I can prove, I replied. Probably longer, but I didn't start recording until recently. You need to contact the police, she said immediately. I will, but I want to be smart about this. If I go to the police now, it becomes a family dispute with accusations flying in all directions. I want to catch them in the act in a way that's undeniable. Helen nodded slowly. What do you need from me? I need witnesses, people who can testify that I'm mentally competent and that my behavior hasn't changed in the ways my children claim. I also need someone who can help me document their manipulation so it's not just my word against theirs. Over the next week, I carefully built my support network. Helen agreed to serve as a witness and to help me organize the evidence. I also reached out to my doctor, Dr. Martinez, who had been my physician for over 15 years. I scheduled a private appointment and explained the situation to him. Dr. Martinez was initially skeptical. Marge, adult children often become concerned about their aging parents, and sometimes that concern can feel overwhelming. Are you sure they're not genuinely worried about you? I played him the recording of Sarah discussing the medication tampering. His expression changed immediately. This is serious, Marge. If she's been moving your medications around, she could have caused you to have a dangerous overdose or miss critical doses. That's not concern, that's endangerment. He agreed to conduct a comprehensive cognitive assessment that would be documented in my medical records. The results showed no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or memory issues. I was functioning at the level of someone 20 years younger with excellent recall, reasoning abilities, and problem-solving skills. I want this in writing, I told him, official medical documentation that states clearly that I am mentally competent and show no signs of cognitive impairment. You'll have it, he assured me. The next step was to prepare for the doctor's appointment my children had scheduled. I knew they would bring their list of incidents and expect Dr. Martinez to witness my confused, disoriented behavior. Instead, I was going to give them a performance they would never forget. But first, I needed to gather more evidence. The recordings I had were damaging, but I wanted to capture them discussing their plan more explicitly. I needed them to incriminate themselves beyond any possible denial. The opportunity came when Michael called to ask if he could bring David over for dinner the following Sunday. We want to spend more time with you, Mom, he said, and Sarah's going to try to stop by too if she can get away from work. I agreed, knowing this would likely be a planning session for my upcoming medical evaluation. I prepared a roast, set the table with my good china, and placed recording devices in 3 different locations throughout the house. Whatever they discussed, I would capture it. They arrived within minutes of each other, which confirmed my suspicion that this was a coordinated meeting rather than a casual family dinner. The conversation during the meal was polite but strained, with each of them asking me questions that felt like tests. "Mom, what did you do yesterday?" David asked. "I went to the grocery store, had lunch with Helen, and worked in the garden," I replied truthfully. "What did you have for lunch?" Sarah followed up. "Chicken salad sandwiches and iced tea." They exchanged glances, as if my perfectly reasonable answers were somehow concerning. After dinner, they insisted on cleaning up while I rested in the living room. This gave them the opportunity to talk freely in the kitchen, not knowing that one of my recording devices was hidden inside the cookie jar on the counter. "The appointment is this Friday at 2 o'clock. Sarah's voice came through clearly on the recording I listened to later. "Dr. Martinez is expecting us to bring documentation of her declining condition." "I've got the list," Michael replied. 23 incidents over the past 4 months, including the medication confusion, the repeated stories, and the car keys in the refrigerator. "What about her behavior during the appointment?" David asked. "We need her to appear confused or disoriented." "I've been researching dementia symptoms," Sarah said. "If she seems anxious or agitated, it will support our case. People with early-stage dementia often become paranoid or suspicious of family members." I felt sick listening to them plan to manipulate my medical evaluation. They were coaching each other on how to present evidence of my incompetence and discussing how to interpret my behavior in the most damaging possible light. "Once we get the doctor's assessment, how long before we can move forward with the power of attorney?" David asked. "If he agrees that she's showing signs of cognitive decline, we can file for guardianship within a few weeks," Sarah replied. "Michael's already contacted the real estate agent about getting the house appraised." "And the care facility?" Michael asked. "I've toured 3 options. Sunny Meadows has an opening in their memory care unit and they accept private pay. It's expensive, but we can afford it once we sell the house." They were planning to put me in a memory care facility for people with dementia based on fabricated evidence and a manipulated medical evaluation. The casual way they discussed dismantling my life was breathtaking in its cruelty. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had given me their entire playbook, recorded in their own voices, with specific dates, times, and plans. I now had everything I needed to stop them. The next morning, I called Helen and asked her to meet me at my lawyer's office. I had known James Crawford for over 30 years. He had handled Robert's estate and our wills, and I trusted him completely. James listened to the recordings with increasing alarm. When the audio ended, he sat back in his chair and shook his head. "Marge, this is one of the most disturbing cases of elder abuse I've encountered in 40 years of practice," he said. "What your children are doing isn't just unethical, it's criminal. They could face charges for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy." "What are my options?" I asked. "Several. We can contact the police immediately and have them arrested. We can file for a restraining order to keep them away from you. We can also contact Adult Protective Services and the state's elder abuse hotline." "What happens to the doctor's appointment on Friday?" James smiled grimly. "You're going to keep that appointment, but instead of their planned ambush, it's going to be our counterattack." We spent the next hour planning our strategy. James would contact the police and provide them with copies of the recordings, but they would hold off on making arrests until after the medical appointment. This would allow my children to incriminate themselves further while giving us additional evidence of their manipulation attempts. Dr. Martinez was brought into the plan and agreed to conduct the appointment as scheduled, but with additional witnesses present. Helen would attend as my advocate, and James would be available by phone if needed. I felt nervous but determined as Friday approached. I had spent months being gaslighted and manipulated by the people I loved most in the world. Now finally, I was going to reclaim my power and expose their deception. The morning of the appointment, I dressed carefully in my best navy blue suit and pearl necklace. I wanted to look competent and dignified, not confused or frail. I placed a final recording device in my purse, knowing that capturing their behavior during the medical evaluation would be the final piece of evidence I needed. As I drove to Dr. Martinez's office, I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago. She had been trusting, perhaps naive, willing to believe that her children had her best interests at heart. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder but wiser, someone who had learned that love without respect is just manipulation, wearing a prettier mask. I arrived at the medical office first and checked in with the receptionist. Helen joined me a few minutes later, squeezing my hand as we sat in the waiting room. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. "I've been ready for months," I replied. "I just didn't know it yet." When Sarah, David, and Michael walked through the door 15 minutes later, their confident expressions faltered slightly when they saw Helen sitting beside me. "What's Helen doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "I asked her to come," I said calmly. "I thought it would be helpful to have someone here who's known me for a long time. Someone who can provide an objective perspective on my mental state." They couldn't object without seeming unreasonable, but I could see them exchanging worried glances. This wasn't part of their plan, and it was making them nervous. When Dr. Martinez called us into his office, all 5 of us crowded into the small space. He had arranged chairs in a semicircle, with his desk positioned so he could observe everyone's interactions. "I understand there are some concerns about Mrs. Peterson's cognitive function," Dr. Martinez began. "I'd like to hear from everyone about what specific changes you've observed." Sarah launched into her prepared presentation, pulling out the folder of documented incidents. She spoke professionally, using medical terminology to describe my supposed symptoms. David and Michael took turns adding details, each one building on the narrative they had constructed. As they spoke, I watched Dr. Martinez's face carefully. He was listening politely, taking notes, but I could see subtle signs that he wasn't buying their story. Occasionally he would glance at me, and I would meet his eyes steadily, showing no signs of the confusion or agitation they were describing. "Mrs. Peterson," Dr. Martinez said when they finished, "how do you respond to these concerns?" This was my moment. I had rehearsed this response, but now that the time had come, I felt completely calm. "Doctor, I appreciate my children's concern, but I have to respectfully disagree with their assessment," I began. "Over the past few months, I've noticed that items in my house have been moved around during their visits. My medications have been rearranged in ways that would make anyone confused, and I've been asked leading questions designed to make me seem forgetful or disoriented. Sarah's face flushed red. Mom, that's not true. We would never. Furthermore, I continued, reaching into my purse, I have been recording our conversations for the past 4 months, and I have documented evidence of their manipulation. The room went completely silent. David's mouth fell open, and Michael went pale. Sarah stared at me as if I had grown a second head. You've been recording us, she whispered. Yes, I have, and what I've captured is very revealing. I turned to Dr. Martinez. Would you like to hear some examples? What followed was the most satisfying 20 minutes of my life. I played selected clips from my recordings, each one more damaging than the last. The recording of Sarah discussing medication tampering, the conversation about staging evidence, the discussion of selling my house and splitting the proceeds. As each recording played, my children's expressions changed from confusion to horror to desperate attempts at damage control. They tried to interrupt, to explain, to deny what was clearly their own voices saying things that couldn't be explained away. Dr. Martinez listened to everything without comment, taking detailed notes. When the final recording ended, he set down his pen and looked directly at my children. In 43 years of medical practice, I have never witnessed such a calculated attempt to manipulate a medical evaluation, he said. What you've described to me today bears no resemblance to the Mrs. Peterson I've been treating for over 15 years, and these recordings make it clear why. He turned to me. Mrs. Peterson, based on my examination and these recordings, I see no evidence of cognitive decline. In fact, your ability to recognize manipulation, gather evidence, and present your case shows remarkably sharp thinking. I will be documenting in your medical records that you are mentally competent and that the concerns raised by your children appear to be unfounded and potentially fraudulent. Sarah tried one last desperate attempt. She's clearly become paranoid and suspicious. The fact that she's been secretly recording us proves that her mental state has deteriorated. Dr. Martinez shook his head. Actually, it proves that she correctly identified a threat and took appropriate action to protect herself. That's not paranoia, that's good judgment. As we left the medical office, my children tried to follow me to the parking lot, probably hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of their plan. But I had one final surprise for them. James Crawford was waiting by my car, along with 2 police officers, Sarah, David, and Michael Peterson. One of the officers said, "You're under arrest for elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted theft by deception." As they were read their rights and led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete peace. The war was over, and I had won not through manipulation or deception, but through patience, intelligence, and careful documentation of the truth. That evening, Helen and I sat in my living room with glasses of wine, listening to the silence of my house without the threat of unwanted visitors or manufactured crises. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel? Sad, certainly. It's devastating to discover that your own children see you as nothing more than an obstacle between them and your money. Angry, yes, but also strangely relieved. Free, I said finally. For the first time in months, I feel completely free. The legal proceedings took several months to resolve. My children eventually pled guilty to reduced charges and were sentenced to community service and restitution. They were also required to attend counseling and had restraining orders placed against them that prevented any contact with me. The house remained mine, as did my independence and my dignity. I changed the locks, updated my will to leave everything to charity, and began the process of rebuilding my life without the constant threat of manipulation hanging over me. I kept the recording devices, though I rarely need them now. They sit in my jewelry box next to Robert's wedding ring, small reminders that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with loud voices or dramatic gestures, but with quiet preparation and unwavering determination to protect what matters most. My children had underestimated me, assuming that age had made me weak and vulnerable. They forgot that I had lived through decades of challenges, raised 3 children, built a successful marriage, and navigated the complex world of adulthood long before they were born. I wasn't a helpless old woman, I was a survivor who had simply been caught off guard by betrayal from an unexpected source. But once I recognized the threat, I did what I had always done. I adapted, I planned, and I fought back. And in the end, the truth was stronger than their carefully constructed lies. The tiny red light in my pill organizer had captured more than just conversations. It had captured my own strength, my own voice, and my own power to determine the course of my life. They thought I had dementia, but what I really had was something far more dangerous to their plans: a clear mind, a strong will, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The weeks following my children's arrest passed in a strange combination of relief and emptiness. For months, my life had been consumed by the need to document their deception and protect myself from their manipulation. Now that the immediate threat was gone, I found myself navigating an unexpected kind of silence, not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful calm of a house that was truly mine again. I established new routines that had nothing to do with defensive strategies or evidence gathering. I woke each morning and made coffee for one without checking over my shoulder. I organized my medications in their proper places without photographing the arrangement as proof of my competence. I answered my phone without wondering who might be plotting against me on the other end. The restraining orders meant my children couldn't contact me directly, but that didn't stop them from trying indirect approaches. Michael's wife Jennifer called twice, claiming she was checking on my well-being and insisting that the whole situation had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Sarah's husband Mark stopped by one afternoon, saying he just wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself properly. I politely but firmly sent them both away, explaining that any contact from family members constituted a violation of the court order. What surprised me most was how quickly I adjusted to their absence. I had expected to feel lonely or guilty about the legal consequences they faced. Instead, I felt lighter, as if I had been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there until it was removed. The constant vigilance, the need to second-guess my own perceptions, the exhausting work of defending my reality against their gaslighting had taken a toll I was only beginning to understand. Helen became my closest confidant during this transition period. She would stop by every few days, sometimes bringing groceries or a book she thought I might enjoy, but mostly just to sit and talk. We would spend hours on my back porch, drinking iced tea and discussing everything except my family drama. She seemed to understand instinctively that I needed normalcy more than sympathy. One afternoon in late summer, Helen arrived with a proposition that would change the trajectory of my new life. She sat down at my kitchen table with a serious expression and placed a manila folder between us. "Marge, I've been thinking about something, and I want to run an idea past you," she began. "You know I've been volunteering with the senior advocacy group at the community center, right?" I nodded. Helen had been involved with various community organizations for as long as I'd known her, always looking for ways to help others. "Well, we've been seeing an increase in cases similar to yours. Adult children manipulating elderly parents, usually with financial motives. The problem is that most victims don't recognize what's happening until it's too late, and even when they do, they often don't know how to fight back." She opened the folder and pulled out several newspaper clippings and printed articles. "Look at these stories. A woman in Phoenix whose son convinced doctors she had Alzheimer's so he could sell her house. A man in Florida whose daughters had him declared incompetent and moved him to a nursing home while they liquidated his assets. It's becoming an epidemic, and the legal system isn't equipped to handle it effectively." I scanned the articles, feeling a familiar chill as I read accounts that echoed my own experience. The tactics were remarkably similar: manufactured evidence of cognitive decline, coordinated family testimony, manipulation of medical evaluations, and rushed legal proceedings to gain control of assets. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "I think you could help other people in similar situations. You have something most victims don't have. Proof, documented evidence of how these schemes work, recorded confessions from the perpetrators, and a successful legal outcome. You could be a powerful advocate for elder abuse prevention." The idea intrigued me, but it also felt overwhelming. I had just reclaimed my own life. Was I ready to immerse myself in other people's family tragedies? "I wouldn't know where to start," I said honestly. "That's where this comes in," Helen replied, pulling out another document. "The State Attorney General's office is starting a new elder abuse prevention initiative. They're looking for advisors who have first-hand experience with these crimes. The position would involve developing educational materials, training law enforcement officers, and serving as a resource for victims and their families." I stared at the job description, struck by the synchronicity of the opportunity. For months I had felt like my intelligence and capabilities were under attack. Now I was being offered a chance to use those same qualities to help others. "They specifically want someone who understands the psychology of family manipulation," Helen continued. Someone who can help victims recognize the warning signs and teach them how to protect themselves. That evening, I called James Crawford to discuss the opportunity. He was enthusiastic about the idea and offered to help me navigate the application process. Marge, you've been through something terrible, but you've also gained expertise that could be invaluable to other people, he said. You understand how these schemes develop, how they escalate, and most importantly, how to fight back effectively. That knowledge could save other families from going through what you experienced. I spent the next week researching the Elder Abuse Prevention Initiative and reading testimonials from other victims. The stories were heartbreakingly familiar. Elderly parents questioning their own sanity as their children systematically undermined their independence, financial assets disappearing, while families insisted it was for the victim's own good, and legal systems that prioritized family concerns over individual rights. What struck me most was how isolated these victims felt. They described the shame of suspecting their own children, the confusion of being told their perceptions were wrong, and the helplessness of fighting a battle they didn't understand. I remembered those feelings vividly, the way doubt had crept into my own mind despite my certainty that something was wrong. I decided to apply for the advisory position, but first, I wanted to test whether I was emotionally ready to relive my experience in service of helping others. I contacted the local senior center and offered to give a presentation about elder abuse prevention. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The center's director, an energetic woman named Patricia Gonzalez, explained that they had been looking for someone to address this topic with their members. We see the warning signs all the time, she told me during our planning meeting. Adult children who suddenly become very involved in their parents' finances, elderly people who seem confused about recent changes in their living situations, families who speak for their elderly relatives instead of letting them speak for themselves. But we haven't known how to address it without seeming like we're interfering in family matters. I spent 2 weeks preparing my presentation, carefully organizing my thoughts and experiences into a coherent narrative that would be educational without being overwhelming. I decided to focus on practical information, how to recognize manipulation tactics, steps to protect oneself legally and financially, and resources for getting help. The morning of the presentation, I woke up feeling nervous but determined. I dressed in my favorite burgundy blazer and pearl earrings, wanting to project competence and authority. As I drove to the senior center, I thought about how different this felt from the medical appointment where I had confronted my children. Then, I had been fighting for my own survival. Now, I was fighting for something larger. The community room was packed with about 60 people, mostly women in their 60s and 70s, but also several middle-aged adults who had come with their parents. Patricia introduced me briefly, mentioning only that I had personal experience with elder abuse and had successfully protected myself from manipulation. I began by sharing some statistics about elder abuse, establishing the scope of the problem without diving immediately into personal details. Then I outlined the most common manipulation tactics, explaining how they worked and why they were effective. Family manipulation is particularly insidious because it exploits our natural trust in the people we love, I explained. We want to believe that our children have our best interests at heart, so we give them the benefit of the doubt even when their behavior suggests otherwise. I could see recognition in several faces as I described gaslighting techniques and manufactured evidence. A woman in the front row was nodding vigorously, and a man near the back was taking detailed notes. Then I made the decision to share my own story. I had debated whether to include personal details, but seeing the engaged faces of my audience, I realized that abstract warnings wouldn't be as powerful as concrete examples. 6 months ago, I was in a very similar situation to what some of you might be experiencing, I began. My 3 adult children had convinced themselves, and were trying to convince others, that I was developing dementia. I told them about the gradual escalation of manipulation, the staged evidence, and the coordinated campaign to have me declared incompetent. I explained how I had recognized what was happening and documented the abuse, and I shared the outcome of the legal proceedings. The response was immediate and intense. As soon as I finished speaking, hands shot up around the room. The questions came rapid fire, each one revealing another family's struggle with similar issues. My daughter keeps insisting I need help managing my finances, but I've been handling money just fine for 70 years, said one woman. She wants me to give her power of attorney just in case, but something about it feels wrong. My son moved back in with me after his divorce, and now he's always pointing out things I've supposedly forgotten or done wrong, shared another. I'm starting to question my own memory. How do you know the difference between genuine concern and manipulation? Asked a man whose wife sat beside him, squeezing his hand supportively. For the next hour, I fielded questions and provided advice, drawing on both my personal experience and the research I had done while preparing my case. I shared practical strategies for protecting assets, documenting manipulation, and finding allies outside the family structure. What moved me most was the sense of validation I could offer these people. Many of them had been questioning their own perceptions, wondering if they were being paranoid or ungrateful. Hearing my story seemed to give them permission to trust their instincts and take their concerns seriously. After the formal presentation ended, several people approached me individually to share more details about their situations. An elderly man named Frank told me his son had been pressuring him to sell his house and move in with the son's family, using increasingly aggressive tactics when Frank refused. A woman named Dorothy described how her daughter had gradually taken over all her medical appointments, speaking for her and making decisions without consulting her. "I feel like I'm disappearing," Dorothy said quietly, "like I'm becoming invisible in my own life." I understood that feeling completely. It was exactly how I had felt during the months when my children were systematically erasing my agency and competence. As I drove home that evening, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced since before Robert's death. The presentation had reminded me that I had valuable knowledge and hard-won expertise that could genuinely help other people. More than that, it had shown me a path forward that could give meaning to the trauma I had endured. I called Helen as soon as I got home and told her about the evening's success. "I want to apply for that advisory position," I said, "and I want to do more presentations like tonight. There are so many people out there who need to hear this information." "I'm proud of you, Marge," she replied. "You've taken something horrible and found a way to use it for good." The application process for the state position took several weeks, involving interviews, background checks, and reference verifications. During that time, I continued giving presentations at senior centers, community groups, and even some law enforcement agencies that were interested in better understanding elder abuse dynamics. Each presentation taught me something new about the scope and complexity of the problem. I learned that financial manipulation often started years before victims recognized it, with small boundary crossings that gradually escalated. I discovered that many elderly people were reluctant to report abuse because they didn't want to cause trouble for their families or were ashamed that their own children would treat them badly. Most importantly, I realized that education and prevention were just as crucial as intervention and enforcement. Many cases of elder abuse could be prevented if potential victims understood the warning signs and took protective steps early in the process. The State Attorney General's office contacted me in early October with news that I had been selected for the advisory position. The role would involve developing educational curricula, training materials for law enforcement and social services, and support resources for victims and their families. My first official project was creating a comprehensive guide for recognizing and responding to family-based financial elder abuse. I worked with attorneys, social workers, and law enforcement officers to develop materials that were both legally accurate and accessible to elderly people who might be experiencing manipulation. The guide included practical checklists for identifying manipulation tactics, step-by-step instructions for documenting abuse, and contact information for legal and social services resources. We also developed a series of role-playing scenarios that could be used in educational workshops to help people practice recognizing and responding to manipulative behavior. Working on these materials was both challenging and therapeutic. I found myself revisiting my own experiences in detail, analyzing the tactics my children had used, and identifying the moments when I could have intervened more effectively. This process helped me understand that while I had ultimately protected myself successfully, there had been earlier opportunities to address the problem that I had missed because I didn't trust my own perceptions. One of the most important insights that emerged from this work was the role of isolation in enabling elder abuse. My children had gradually separated me from my support network, discouraging social activities and creating situations where I was dependent on them for information and assistance. Breaking that isolation had been crucial to my ability to fight back. This understanding led to the development of what we called the social safety net approach to elder abuse prevention. Instead of focusing solely on individual protective measures, we emphasized the importance of maintaining strong connections with friends, neighbors, and community organizations who could provide objective perspectives and support. I began incorporating this concept into my presentations, encouraging elderly people to cultivate relationships outside their immediate family and to share concerns with trusted friends before problems escalated. I also worked with community organizations to develop programs that would help elderly people stay connected and engaged. One such program was a buddy system that paired elderly community members with trained volunteers who would maintain regular contact and serve as advocates if concerns arose. The volunteers were taught to recognize signs of manipulation and abuse, and they had clear protocols for reporting suspicious situations to appropriate authorities. Another initiative was a series of financial literacy workshops specifically designed for elderly people who might be vulnerable to manipulation. These workshops covered topics like protecting personal information, understanding power of attorney documents, and recognizing common financial scams. As winter approached, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed over the course of a single year. 12 months earlier, I had been a vulnerable target of my own children's greed and manipulation. Now I was a recognized expert in elder abuse prevention, working with state officials to develop policies and programs that could protect thousands of other elderly people. The work was demanding and sometimes emotionally difficult, but it was also deeply satisfying. Every presentation I gave, every guide I helped develop, every training session I conducted represented an opportunity to prevent someone else from experiencing the betrayal and gaslighting I had endured. I had also discovered that helping others heal from similar trauma was helping me process my own experiences. Each victim I spoke with, each success story I heard, reinforced my understanding that what had happened to me was not a reflection of my weakness or naivety, but rather a consequence of my children's choices and actions. The isolation and self-doubt that had characterized the worst period of the abuse were gradually being replaced by connection and confidence. I was building new relationships with colleagues and community members who valued my expertise and respected my judgment. I was using my intelligence and analytical skills in ways that felt meaningful and impactful. Most surprisingly, I was discovering aspects of myself that I hadn't known existed. The shy, accommodating woman who had spent decades prioritizing her family's needs over her own was being replaced by someone more assertive and self-assured. I was learning to trust my instincts, speak up when something felt wrong, and advocate not just for myself but for others who needed support. This personal transformation was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire ordeal. While I would never have chosen to experience my children's betrayal, I had to acknowledge that the process of fighting back had revealed strengths and capabilities I might never have discovered otherwise. As the year drew to a close, I received a letter that brought my personal and professional growth full circle. It was from a woman named Margaret Chen, who had attended one of my early presentations at a senior center. Margaret explained that she had been experiencing manipulation from her adult son similar to what I had described. Inspired by my story, she had begun documenting suspicious incidents and had eventually gathered enough evidence to expose her son's financial abuse. She had successfully protected her assets and obtained a restraining order against him. "Your presentation saved my life," she wrote, "not just financially, but emotionally. You helped me trust myself again and gave me the courage to fight back. I wanted you to know that your terrible experience has prevented someone else from going through the same thing." Reading Margaret's letter, I felt a profound sense of purpose and closure. The pain and betrayal I had experienced had been transformed into something positive and protective. My children's attempt to diminish and control me had ultimately led to my becoming a stronger advocate for myself and others. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and looked around at the home I had fought so hard to keep. Every item in the room told a story of my life with Robert, my years as a mother, and my journey toward independence. This house was more than just property. It was a testament to my resilience and determination. I thought about my children and wondered if they ever reflected on what they had lost through their greed and manipulation. They had sacrificed their relationship with their mother, their children's grandmother, and their own integrity for money they would never receive. In trying to gain control of my assets, they had lost something far more valuable: the love and respect of the woman who had given them life. But their loss had become my liberation. In fighting their manipulation, I had rediscovered my own strength. In documenting their abuse, I had developed skills that were now helping others. In refusing to be silently victimized, I had found my voice as an advocate and educator. The little recording device that had captured their plotting was still in my jewelry box, a reminder of the power of preparation and the importance of trusting one's instincts. But now it was accompanied by letters from other victims I had helped, certificates from training programs I had developed, and awards recognizing my contributions to elder abuse prevention. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt grateful for the unexpected direction my life had taken. I had not chosen this path, but I had walked it with determination and dignity. I had refused to be diminished by other people's greed, and had instead found ways to grow stronger and more purposeful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to help other elderly people protect themselves from manipulation and abuse. I would continue developing educational programs, training law enforcement officers, and advocating for stronger legal protections for vulnerable adults. But tonight, I was simply a 73-year-old woman who had faced betrayal and emerged victorious, who had turned trauma into advocacy, and who had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with wisdom, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. The war my children had started was over, and I had won not just my freedom, but a new understanding of my own capabilities and worth. They had tried to convince the world that I was losing my mind, but in fighting their lies, I had found my true self. Spring arrived with an unexpected phone call that would test everything I had learned about trust, family, and forgiveness. I was in my garden, planting the tomato seedlings I had started on my kitchen windowsill, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello, is this Marge Peterson?" The voice was young, hesitant, with a slight tremor that suggested nervousness. "Yes, this is Marge. Who is this?" "My name is Emma Peterson. I'm Sarah's daughter, your granddaughter." I froze, my gardening gloves still dirty with soil, the phone pressed against my ear as if I might have misheard. Emma was Sarah's eldest child, 22 years old, and finishing her senior year at college. I hadn't spoken to any of my grandchildren since the restraining orders were put in place, though I thought about them constantly. "Emma," I said carefully, my heart racing, "how did you get my number?" "I found it in Mom's old address book. I know about the restraining order, and I know I'm probably not supposed to call you, but I had to. I need to talk to someone, and you're the only person I can think of who might understand." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever had prompted this call, it wasn't casual curiosity about her estranged grandmother. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" The endearment slipped out before I could stop it, years of grandmotherly instinct overriding legal caution. "It's happening again," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "What Mom did to you, she's doing it to Grandpa now, to Dad's father, and nobody believes me when I try to tell them what I'm seeing." My blood ran cold. Sarah's father-in-law, Richard Brennan, was in his early 80s and had been widowed about 5 years ago. He lived independently in a small apartment downtown, and had always struck me as sharp and capable when I'd known him during family gatherings. "Tell me what you've observed," I said, settling onto my garden bench and giving Emma my full attention. The story that unfolded was chillingly familiar. Sarah had gradually inserted herself into Richard's life, ostensibly to help him manage his affairs after his wife's death. She had convinced him to give her power of attorney over his financial matters, claiming it would make things easier for tax purposes and bill paying. She had begun questioning his memory and decision-making abilities, particularly around other family members. "She keeps telling Dad that Grandpa is getting confused and forgetting things," Emma explained. "But when I spend time with him, he seems fine. His mind is sharp, he remembers everything about our conversations, and he's still managing his own household and medications without any problems." "Has she moved any of his belongings or changed his living situation?" "That's just it," Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she found someone who was taking her seriously. "Last month, she convinced him to move to a smaller apartment because she said the stairs in his building were becoming dangerous for him. But he was climbing those stairs just fine, and the new place costs twice as much rent. When I asked him about it, he seemed confused about why he had agreed to move. The pattern was unmistakable. Sarah was using the same playbook she had used on me, gradually undermining Richard's confidence and independence while positioning herself as his concerned caregiver and protector. "Emma, have you tried talking to your father about this?" "I did, but he just says Mom knows more about these things because she's a nurse, and he trusts her judgment about medical issues. He thinks I'm being paranoid because of what happened with you." The irony was bitter. My own son was dismissing his daughter's concerns about manipulation tactics while failing to recognize that his wife was using those exact same tactics on his father. What about other family members? Does Richard have other children or close friends who might notice what's happening? He has a sister in California, but she's in her 70s and doesn't visit often. Most of his friends have passed away or moved to retirement communities. Mom has become his primary support system, which gives her a lot of control over what information he gets about his own life. I closed my eyes, remembering the isolation my own children had carefully constructed around me. By becoming indispensable, Sarah had positioned herself to manipulate Richard's perceptions and limit his access to outside perspectives. "Emma, why are you calling me? What do you want me to do?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I just needed someone to believe me, someone who understands what this looks like. I've been reading about elder abuse online, and everything I'm finding matches what I'm seeing happen to Grandpa, but I don't know how to stop it, and I'm afraid that if I try to intervene, I'll just make things worse for him." I understood her dilemma perfectly. Emma was in the same position I had been in during the early stages of my children's manipulation, seeing clearly what was happening, but lacking the evidence or support to effectively challenge it. "Would you be willing to document what you're observing?" I asked. "The same way I documented what your mother and uncles were doing to me." "You mean record conversations?" "That's one option, but there are other ways to gather evidence too. Taking photographs of his living situation, keeping detailed notes of conversations, documenting any changes in his financial or medical care arrangements. The key is creating an objective record that can't be dismissed as misperception or family drama." Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her weighing the implications of what I was suggesting. She would be investigating her own mother's behavior, potentially putting herself in conflict with her entire family. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "But would you be willing to help me? I know about the restraining order, and I know what Mom did to you was terrible, but you're the only person who understands how these schemes work." The request put me in an incredibly difficult position. Helping Emma would potentially violate the restraining order, could be seen as interfering in my former family's affairs, and would definitely put me back in conflict with my children. On the other hand, an innocent elderly man was being manipulated by someone I knew to be capable of elaborate deception, and his own granddaughter was asking for help protecting him. "Let me think about this too," I said. "Can you call me again tomorrow evening? Same time?" "Yes, I can do that. And Grandma Marge, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for believing me." After hanging up, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the maple tree Robert had planted when we first moved to this house. The peaceful routine I had built over the past year suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the possibility of being drawn back into the toxic dynamics I had worked so hard to escape. But Emma's call had also awakened something in me that I couldn't ignore. During my work with the State Attorney General's office, I had encountered dozens of cases where family members knew abuse was occurring, but felt powerless to intervene. I had developed resources and strategies specifically for people in Emma's situation, but I had never imagined I would be called upon to apply them within my own extended family. That evening, I called James Crawford to discuss the legal implications of helping Emma. "The restraining order specifically prohibits contact with your children, but it doesn't mention your grandchildren," he explained. "However, if you're gathering evidence against Sarah, it could be argued that you're circumventing the spirit of the order even if you're not technically violating its terms. What would you advise?" "Legally, you're probably safe as long as you don't initiate direct contact with Sarah, David, or Michael. But practically, this could reopen conflicts that you've put behind you. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I considered his question carefully. The past year had been peaceful and productive, focused on helping strangers rather than fighting with family members. Did I really want to risk that tranquility to help a granddaughter I barely knew protect a man who was no longer part of my life? The answer came to me as I remembered Dorothy, the woman from one of my early presentations who had described feeling invisible in her own life. Richard Brennan was being systematically erased, just as I had been, just as countless other elderly people were every day. If I had the knowledge and experience to help stop that process, didn't I have an obligation to act? When Emma called the following evening, I had made my decision. "I'll help you," I said without preamble. "But we need to be smart about this, and we need to be prepared for the consequences. Your mother is not going to react well if she discovers what we're doing." "I understand. What do we do first?" Over the next hour, I walked Emma through the same process I had used to document my own situation. We discussed the importance of detailed record keeping, the various methods for gathering evidence, and the legal resources available for reporting elder abuse. "The most important thing is to maintain your grandfather's trust," I explained. "You can't help him if he stops confiding in you, or if your mother convinces him that you're trying to cause trouble. He trusts me completely right now. I'm probably the only family member he talks to honestly about how he's feeling." Good. That's your greatest asset in this situation. Use that trust to understand what's really happening in his life, but be careful not to put him in a position where he feels he has to choose between you and your mother. We developed a plan for Emma to begin documenting Sarah's interactions with Richard while maintaining her role as a concerned granddaughter. She would visit him regularly, take note of any changes in his living situation or daily routines, and keep detailed records of conversations where he expressed confusion or concern about decisions he had supposedly made. What about recording devices? Emma asked. That's more complicated, I admitted. The legal requirements for recording conversations vary by state, and since your grandfather would be involved, we need to be careful about consent issues. Let's start with written documentation and see what patterns emerge. For the next 3 weeks, Emma maintained a careful balance between normal granddaughter visits and evidence gathering. She called me every few days to report what she had observed, and the picture that emerged was disturbingly familiar. Sarah was systematically isolating Richard from other family members by creating conflicts and misunderstandings. She had convinced him that his sister in California was too busy with her own health problems to want frequent contact. She had discouraged visits from old friends by suggesting that hosting guests was too stressful for someone his age. More concerning were the financial irregularities Emma discovered. Richard had always been careful with money, but Sarah had convinced him to make several large purchases that seemed out of character. Expensive medical alert system he didn't want, a comprehensive insurance policy that duplicated coverage he already had, and a home security system for an apartment building that already had security measures. She's handling all his paperwork now, Emma reported during one of our calls. He mentioned that she's been helping him reorganize his finances to make everything simpler. When I asked him what that meant, he seemed vague about the details. The pattern of financial control was particularly alarming because it suggested that Sarah was already in the process of redirecting Richard's assets. Unlike my situation, where my children had been planning to gain control gradually, Sarah appeared to be moving more quickly, perhaps having learned from her failed attempt with me. Emma, I think it's time to involve some outside resources, I said. Your grandfather needs an independent advocate, someone who can review his financial arrangements and make sure he's not being taken advantage of. How do we do that without alerting Mom to what we're doing? There are senior advocacy organizations that specialize in these situations. They can conduct what's called a wellness check that looks like a routine community service but actually assesses whether someone is being manipulated or abused. I gave Emma the contact information for several organizations, including some I had worked with through my state position. We agreed that she would approach Richard about accepting these services by framing them as general resources for elderly people rather than responses to specific concerns. Meanwhile, I began my own discreet investigation into Sarah's recent activities. Through my connections in the elder advocacy community, I learned that she had recently attended several seminars on financial planning for elderly clients. She had also joined a professional organization for people who provided care management services for seniors. These activities suggested that Sarah was professionalizing her manipulation tactics, possibly with the intention of expanding beyond Richard to other elderly clients. The thought that she might be using the skills she had developed while abusing me to victimize other people's family members was deeply disturbing. I shared this information with the State Attorney General's office, which had been tracking patterns of professional elder abuse. They were very interested in Sarah's activities and agreed to monitor her involvement with senior services organizations. 3 weeks after Emma first contacted me, she called with urgent news that changed everything. Grandma Marge, something's happened. Grandpa fell yesterday and went to the emergency room. He's okay, just some bruises and a sprained wrist, but Mom is using the fall to push for major changes in his living situation. What kind of changes? She wants him to move into an assisted living facility immediately. She's saying the fall proves he can't live safely on his own anymore, and she's scheduled tours at 3 different places for this week. I felt a familiar chill. The manufactured crisis, the rapid escalation, the pressure to make major decisions while emotions were running high. It was exactly the same playbook Sarah had used during my supposed medical emergency. Did you witness the fall? Do you know what actually happened? That's the thing, Emma said, her voice tight with suspicion. I talked to Grandpa about it, and his description doesn't match what Mom is telling everyone. He said he tripped over a box that was sitting in his hallway, but he doesn't remember putting any box there. When I asked Mom about it, she said he probably forgot moving it and just doesn't want to admit he's becoming forgetful. The staged accident was a new escalation in Sarah's tactics, more dangerous than anything she had attempted with me. By creating a situation that could have seriously injured Richard, she was demonstrating a level of callousness that went beyond financial manipulation. "Emma, this has gone beyond what we can handle on our own. Your grandfather is in immediate danger, and we need to involve the authorities." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need to contact Adult Protective Services and the police. If your mother staged that fall, she committed a serious crime. If she's using it to pressure your grandfather into decisions he's not capable of making in his current emotional state, that's exploitation." Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was shaky but determined. "What do I need to do?" I walked her through the process of filing an elder abuse report, emphasizing the importance of providing specific details and timeline information. I also gave her the contact information for James Crawford, explaining that Richard might need his own legal representation if Sarah tried to use the fall as evidence of his incompetence. "There's something else," I said. "I think it's time for me to get directly involved. Your grandfather needs an advocate who understands how these manipulation schemes work, and I may be the only person available who has that experience." "But what about the restraining order?" "The restraining order protects me from your mother, but it doesn't prevent me from helping her victim. If I'm careful about how I approach this, I can provide support for your grandfather without violating any legal restrictions." That night, I lay awake thinking about the decision I was about to make. For over a year, I had been building a new life focused on helping strangers, maintaining careful boundaries around my own traumatic experiences. Now I was about to step directly back into the conflict that had nearly destroyed me, this time not as a victim but as a defender of someone else. The risks were significant. Sarah would undoubtedly escalate her tactics if she discovered I was working against her. The legal protections I had built around myself might not extend to situations where I was actively investigating her behavior, and there was always the possibility that she had learned from her previous failure and developed more sophisticated methods of manipulation. But Richard Brennan deserved the same chance I had been given, the opportunity to understand what was being done to him and to fight back with support from people who believed him. If I could provide that support, if I could use my hard-won expertise to protect another elderly person from the same abuse I had endured, then the risks were worth taking. The next morning, I called the State Attorney General's office and requested a meeting with the Elder Abuse Unit. I explained the situation with Richard and asked for their guidance on how to proceed without compromising any ongoing investigations or legal protections. The response was more supportive than I had expected. The unit supervisor, a sharp woman named Detective Angela Rodriguez, explained that they had been looking for an opportunity to investigate Sarah's activities more thoroughly. "Your daughter-in-law has come to our attention in connection with several other cases," she said. "We've been tracking a pattern of people who attend financial planning seminars and then target elderly clients for various forms of manipulation. Sarah fits the profile, and if she's abusing her father-in-law, it gives us grounds for a more comprehensive investigation." "What would that investigation involve?" "We'd want to document everything that's happening with Mr. Brennan, but we'd also be looking at her other activities, financial records, client lists, if she has any, communication with other people in the senior services industry. If she's running a broader scheme, we want to shut it down before more people get hurt." Detective Rodriguez assigned a caseworker to monitor Richard's situation and coordinate with Emma's documentation efforts. They also arranged for an undercover social worker to conduct a wellness check that would assess his living situation and mental competency. Meanwhile, I worked with James Crawford to explore legal options for challenging Sarah's power of attorney over Richard's finances. If we could prove that she had obtained that authority through deception or while Richard was under duress, it might be possible to have it revoked. "The key is establishing a timeline," James explained. "If we can show that her manipulation began before she obtained power of attorney, we can argue that his consent was not freely given." Emma's documentation was crucial for establishing that timeline. Her careful notes revealed a pattern of escalating control that had begun almost immediately after Richard's wife died. Sarah had inserted herself into his life during a period of grief and vulnerability, then gradually expanded her influence until she was making decisions about his finances, healthcare, and living arrangements. The assisted living facility tours that Sarah had scheduled became our first opportunity to observe her manipulation tactics directly. Emma convinced Richard to let her accompany him to the visits, positioning herself as a supportive granddaughter who wanted to help him make an informed decision. What she witnessed and documented was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Sarah had pre-selected facilities that were significantly more expensive than Richard's current living costs, but she presented them as necessary for his safety and well-being. When Richard expressed concerns about the cost, or questioned whether he really needed such intensive care, Sarah would remind him of his recent fall and suggest that his judgment might be compromised by the trauma. She kept saying things like, "Dad, I know this is hard to accept, but we have to face reality about your limitations," Emma reported. And every time he tried to argue or ask questions, she'd interrupt him and speak to the facility staff as if he wasn't there. The pattern was identical to what Sarah had done during my medical appointments, speaking for the elderly person and interpreting their responses in ways that supported her narrative of decline and incompetence. But Emma's presence as a witness and advocate changed the dynamic significantly. When Richard expressed preferences or concerns, Emma would acknowledge them and ask follow-up questions that demonstrated she was taking his opinions seriously. This support seemed to give him confidence to be more assertive about his own needs and preferences. After the third facility tour, Richard told Emma privately that he didn't want to move to assisted living at all. "I don't understand why Sarah thinks I need all this help," he said. "I've been managing fine on my own, and I like my independence, but she seems so worried about me, and she knows more about medical things than I do." Emma gently encouraged him to trust his own feelings about his living situation, while also expressing support for his autonomy. "Grandpa, what do you think would help you feel safer at home?" she asked. "Are there specific things you're worried about, or is this more about what other people think you should do?" "I think it's more about what other people think," he admitted. "After the fall, everyone's been treating me like I'm suddenly fragile, but I've had falls before, and I've always been fine." This conversation gave Emma the opening she needed to suggest that Richard might benefit from talking to someone independent about his options, someone who wasn't emotionally invested in any particular outcome. "There are people who specialize in helping seniors figure out what kind of support they actually need," she explained. "They're not trying to sell you anything or convince you to make any specific choices. They just help you understand your options." Richard was interested in this idea, especially when Emma explained that such a consultation could help him make decisions that felt right to him rather than decisions based on other people's fears. The independent assessment was conducted by a geriatric social worker who specialized in capacity evaluations. She spent several hours with Richard, reviewing his medical history, assessing his cognitive function, and discussing his preferences for his living situation. Her report was unambiguous. Richard was mentally competent to make his own decisions about his living arrangements, had no significant physical limitations that would require assisted living, and was capable of continuing to live independently with minimal support services. More importantly, she documented several concerning aspects of Sarah's involvement in his care. The power of attorney documents had been signed shortly after Richard's wife's death, when he was grieving and potentially vulnerable to pressure. The financial changes Sarah had implemented were not in Richard's best interests and appeared designed to benefit the person managing his accounts rather than Richard himself. Armed with this independent assessment, James Crawford was able to file a motion to revoke Sarah's power of attorney and request a full investigation of her financial management of Richard's affairs. The motion hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late spring. Emma would testify about what she had observed, the social worker would present her assessment, and I would provide expert testimony about elder abuse patterns and manipulation tactics. Sarah's response to the legal challenge was swift and predictable. She filed counter-motions claiming that Richard was being manipulated by family members who were trying to gain access to his assets. She argued that the investigation was being driven by my desire for revenge against her, and that Emma was being used as a pawn in a larger family conflict. But Sarah had made a crucial error in her strategy. By focusing her defense on attacking my motives and credibility, she was essentially admitting that I had been right about her manipulation tactics. If I had been paranoid or delusional when I accused her of elder abuse, as she had claimed during my own legal proceedings, then my involvement in Richard's case should have been easily dismissed as more evidence of my mental instability. Instead, her aggressive response to my participation suggested that she recognized me as a legitimate threat, someone whose experience and knowledge could expose her methods. The hearing itself was less dramatic than I had anticipated, but more satisfying than I had dared to hope. Richard testified clearly and confidently about his preferences for his living situation and his concerns about the financial decisions that had been made on his behalf. Emma presented her documentation with the precision of someone who had learned to be a careful observer. The social worker's assessment spoke for itself. When I took the stand to provide expert testimony about elder abuse patterns, I felt none of the nervousness I had experienced during my own legal proceedings. This time, I was not fighting for my own credibility or defending my own perceptions. I was simply sharing knowledge that could help protect someone else. Sarah's attorney tried to discredit my testimony by emphasizing my personal relationship to the case and my obvious bias against Sarah. But the prosecutor was prepared for this line of attack. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, "in your professional work with the State Attorney General's office, how many cases of elder abuse have you reviewed?" "Over 200 documented cases in the past year," I replied. "And in your expert opinion, do the tactics you observed in your own case match the patterns you've seen in other cases of family-based elder abuse?" "Yes, they do. The isolation, the manufactured evidence of incapacity, the financial manipulation, and the pressure to make major life decisions during periods of vulnerability are all common elements in these cases. Does the case of Mr. Brennan fit these same patterns?" "Unfortunately, yes. The tactics being used against Mr. Brennan are nearly identical to those documented in many other cases of elder abuse." The judge's ruling was comprehensive and damning. Sarah's power of attorney was immediately revoked, and she was ordered to provide a full accounting of all financial transactions she had conducted on Richard's behalf. The assisted living placement was suspended pending Richard's own decision about his living arrangements. Most importantly, the judge ordered a full investigation into Sarah's other activities as a care manager and financial advisor for elderly clients. As we left the courthouse that day, Richard walked with Emma and me to the parking lot. He looked older than I remembered from family gatherings years ago, but his eyes were clear and his expression was determined. "Marge," he said, "I owe you an apology. I never understood what you went through with your children, and I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up for you when I should have." "Richard, you don't owe me any apology. You weren't in a position to know what was happening, and Sarah is very skilled at hiding her true behavior from people who might challenge her. Still, I should have listened better, and I want you to know that I'm grateful you helped Emma protect me, even after everything my daughter-in-law put you through." As I drove home that afternoon, I reflected on the strange turn my life had taken. 2 years ago, I had been a victim of elder abuse, fighting for my own survival and credibility. Now I was helping other victims, using my experience to protect people I barely knew and rebuild relationships with family members I had thought were lost forever. Emma and I had grown close during our weeks of working together, and I had rediscovered the joy of having a relationship with one of my grandchildren. She was smart, compassionate, and brave enough to challenge injustice even when it came from within her own family. "Grandma Marge," she had said after the hearing, "I want to keep learning about this work you do. I want to understand how to help other people who are going through what Grandpa went through." The prospect of mentoring Emma in elder advocacy work filled me with a sense of legacy and continuity that I hadn't expected to find. Perhaps the traumatic experience of my children's betrayal would ultimately result in something positive for future generations. That evening, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and thought about the complicated nature of family relationships. Sarah, David, and Michael had hurt me deeply, but their actions had also led to personal growth and professional purpose that I might never have discovered otherwise. Emma's courage in reaching out to me had not only protected her grandfather, but had also given me the opportunity to reconnect with a part of my family that I had thought was lost forever. The little recording devices in my jewelry box had started as tools of survival, but they had evolved into symbols of empowerment and justice. The skills I had learned in protecting myself were now being used to protect others, and the voice I had found in defending my own dignity was being used to advocate for people who hadn't yet found their own voices. As the sun set over my garden, I felt grateful for the unexpected paths that life had offered me. I had not chosen to become an expert in elder abuse, but I had embraced that role with determination and purpose. I had not planned to become estranged from my own children, but I had used that painful experience to build stronger relationships with people who shared my values and respected my worth. The war that my children had started was finally over, not because they had been defeated, but because I had grown beyond the need to fight them. I had found my own power, my own voice, and my own purpose. And in doing so, I had discovered that sometimes the most meaningful victories are not about defeating our enemies, but about becoming the person we were meant to be all along. The investigation into Sarah's broader activities uncovered a network of elder exploitation that reached far beyond anything I had imagined during my own ordeal. What Detective Rodriguez and her team discovered was not just isolated incidents of family manipulation, but a sophisticated operation that targeted vulnerable elderly people across 3 states. Sarah had been operating under multiple professional identities, presenting herself as a certified elder care consultant, a financial advisor specializing in senior services, and a healthcare advocate for people with cognitive impairments. She had created convincing websites, obtained legitimate-looking credentials from questionable certification organizations, and built a client base of elderly people who trusted her completely. The modus operandi was remarkably consistent across all her cases. She would identify elderly people who were recently widowed, socially isolated, or dealing with minor health issues. She would offer her services as a compassionate professional who specialized in helping seniors navigate the complex challenges of aging. Once she gained their trust, she would gradually assume control over their finances, healthcare decisions, and living arrangements. What made Sarah's operation particularly insidious was her medical background. As a nurse practitioner, she had the knowledge and credibility to convince both victims and their families that her recommendations were medically necessary. She could identify medications that might cause confusion if taken incorrectly, create situations that would make elderly people appear disoriented, and speak authoritatively about cognitive decline in ways that discouraged questions or second opinions. The investigation revealed that over the past 3 years, Sarah had defrauded at least 15 elderly clients out of a combined total of nearly $2 million. Some had lost their homes, others had been placed in expensive care facilities against their wishes, and several had been isolated from family members who might have questioned Sarah's influence. One case was particularly heartbreaking. An 80-year-old woman named Dorothy Martinez had hired Sarah to help manage her medications after a minor stroke. Within 6 months, Sarah had convinced Dorothy that she was developing dementia and needed comprehensive care management. Dorothy's daughter lived in another state and relied on Sarah's reports about her mother's condition. By the time the daughter realized something was wrong, Dorothy had signed over power of attorney to Sarah and had been moved to a memory care facility that cost $8,000 per month. Dorothy had died in that facility, confused and alone, still believing that her own daughter had abandoned her because she was too much trouble to care for. Her daughter only learned the truth when the state investigation began, and Detective Rodriguez contacted her with questions about Sarah's involvement in her mother's care. Learning about Dorothy's case affected me more deeply than I had expected. I could so easily have ended up in her situation, isolated in an expensive facility, while my children divided my assets and told themselves they were doing what was best for me. The only difference was that I had recognized the manipulation early enough to fight back, and I had been fortunate enough to have friends and resources that many elderly people lack. The scope of Sarah's operation also explained why she had been so confident during the manipulation of both Richard and me. She had practiced these techniques on multiple victims, refined her methods based on what worked most effectively, and developed contingency plans for dealing with resistance or suspicion. Detective Rodriguez shared with me some of the evidence they had gathered from Sarah's computer and files. There were detailed psychological profiles of her victims, noting their vulnerabilities, fears, and the most effective approaches for gaining their compliance. There were financial spreadsheets tracking the assets of each client and projecting potential profits from various manipulation strategies. Most disturbing were the training materials Sarah had developed for recruiting and training other people to use similar methods. She had been in the early stages of franchising her operation, teaching other healthcare professionals how to identify and exploit elderly victims. She was building an entire industry around elder abuse, Detective Rodriguez explained during one of our meetings. If we hadn't stopped her when we did, she could have trained dozens of other people to use these methods. The evidence against Sarah was overwhelming, but bringing her to justice proved more complicated than I had anticipated. She had been careful to operate within legal gray areas, using legitimate-sounding contracts and power of attorney documents to cover her activities. Many of her victims were no longer competent to testify against her, and their families often lacked detailed knowledge of what had happened. The prosecution needed victims who could clearly articulate what had been done to them and provide evidence of the manipulation tactics Sarah had used. Richard's case was important because he was still mentally competent and had Emma as a witness to support his testimony. My own case provided crucial background about Sarah's methods and motivations, but we needed more. The prosecutor wanted to find other victims who could testify about similar experiences, creating a pattern that would be impossible for Sarah to explain away as misunderstandings or family disputes. That's when Detective Rodriguez asked if I would be willing to help locate and interview other potential victims. My work with the State Attorney General's office had given me extensive knowledge about how elder abuse investigations were conducted, and my personal experience with Sarah's methods would help me recognize similar patterns in other cases. We need someone who can talk to these elderly victims in a way that doesn't feel like a police interrogation, she explained. Someone who understands what they've been through and can help them feel safe enough to share their experiences. I agreed to help, but I insisted on bringing Emma with me. She had proven herself to be compassionate and perceptive during our work on Richard's case, and I thought having a younger family member present might help victims feel more comfortable talking about family-related manipulation. Our first interview was with an elderly man named Frank Costello, who had hired Sarah 18 months earlier to help him manage his finances after his wife's death. Frank lived in a senior apartment complex about an hour from my home, and he had agreed to meet with us after Detective Rodriguez explained that we were investigating concerns about Sarah's business practices. Frank was 91 years old, with thick white hair and intelligent gray eyes that reminded me of my late husband Robert. He walked slowly but steadily, and his handshake was firm when he greeted us in the lobby of his building. "I hope you can help me understand what happened with that woman," he said as he led us to a quiet corner of the community room. "I've been feeling like such a fool since the police started asking questions about her." Frank's story followed the familiar pattern. Sarah had approached him through a referral from his doctor's office, presenting herself as a specialist in helping widowed seniors transition to independent financial management. She had been warm, professional, and seemingly knowledgeable about the challenges facing elderly people. She made me feel like she really understood what I was going through. Frank explained, "Losing Helen was the hardest thing I'd ever experienced, and suddenly I was supposed to handle all these financial matters that she had always managed. Sarah seemed like a godsend." Initially, Sarah's help had been genuinely useful. She had organized Frank's paperwork, helped him understand his investment accounts, and set up systems for managing his bills and expenses. Frank had been grateful for her assistance and had recommended her services to several friends. But gradually, Sarah had begun making changes that didn't seem necessary or beneficial. She had convinced Frank to consolidate his accounts with a financial management company that charged higher fees than his previous arrangements. She had talked him into purchasing expensive insurance policies that duplicated coverage he already had. Most concerning, she had persuaded him to give her power of attorney over his financial affairs. She said it was just a precaution, in case I ever became too sick to handle things myself, Frank said. She promised she would never use it unless it was absolutely necessary for my well-being. Within 6 months of obtaining power of attorney, Sarah had used it to move Frank's assets into accounts that gave her greater control over his finances. She had sold his car, claiming that driving was becoming dangerous for someone his age, and had arranged for expensive transportation services that she managed. She had even convinced him to consider selling his apartment and moving to a facility where she could oversee his care more effectively. "The strange thing was that I never felt like I was making these decisions," Frank said. "Sarah would present me with information about why something needed to change, and then suddenly arrangements would be made without me really understanding how we had gotten from conversation to action." Emma and I exchanged glances, recognizing the same manipulation tactics that had been used against both Richard and me. Sarah was expert at creating situations where her victims felt like they were participating in decisions while actually having very little control over the outcomes. "Frank," I said gently, "did you ever feel confused or forgetful during your interactions with Sarah? Did she ever suggest that you might be having memory problems?" His face darkened with anger. "Oh yes, she did that constantly. If I questioned something she had arranged, or if I didn't remember a conversation the way she described it, she would get this concerned look and suggest that I might want to have my memory checked. She made me feel like I was losing my mind." "But you weren't," Emma said firmly. "Your memory seems perfectly clear to me right now." "It is clear," Frank replied. "It always was. But Sarah had a way of making me doubt myself, of making me feel like I couldn't trust my own perceptions." Frank's case was particularly valuable to the prosecution because he had kept detailed records of his interactions with Sarah. As a retired accountant, he had a habit of documenting financial transactions and keeping copies of all agreements and contracts. He had also written notes about conversations with Sarah, including several instances where her version of events differed significantly from his own recollections. "I started writing things down because I was worried about my memory," he explained. "But looking back at my notes now, I can see that my memory was fine. It was Sarah who was changing her story, or claiming we had discussed things that never happened." Frank's documentation provided crucial evidence of Sarah's deception tactics. The notes showed a clear pattern of gaslighting, where Sarah would deny previous conversations, claim that Frank had agreed to things he had no memory of agreeing to, and insist that his confusion was evidence of cognitive decline. More importantly, Frank's records included copies of the financial documents Sarah had used to gain control of his assets. James Crawford reviewed these materials and identified several irregularities that suggested fraud and undue influence. These power of attorney documents were signed when Frank was under significant emotional distress, James explained. The timing, combined with the language Sarah used to convince him it was necessary, suggests that his consent may not have been freely given. Over the next month, Emma and I interviewed 6 more of Sarah's former clients. Each conversation revealed similar patterns of manipulation, financial exploitation, and psychological abuse. Some victims had lost their homes, others had been isolated from family members, and several had been placed in expensive care facilities against their wishes. What struck me most about these interviews was how grateful the victims were to have someone believe their accounts of what had happened. Many had tried to explain their concerns to family members or other professionals, only to be told that their confusion was evidence of declining mental capacity. "You're the first person who has listened to me and not made me feel crazy," said one woman named Betty Richardson, who had hired Sarah to help manage her medications after a hospital stay. "Everyone kept telling me I should be grateful that Sarah was taking such good care of me, but I felt like a prisoner in my own life." Betty's case was particularly disturbing because it involved medical manipulation. Sarah had convinced Betty's doctor that she was having medication compliance issues, leading to prescriptions for drugs that caused confusion and disorientation. When Betty complained about feeling confused, Sarah used her symptoms as evidence that she needed more intensive supervision. "I realized later that the confusion only happened after Sarah organized my medications," Betty told us. "When I was in the hospital and the nurses were managing everything, my mind was perfectly clear. But at home, with Sarah's pill organizers and schedules, I felt like I was in a fog." Emma was visibly shaken by Betty's account. "How could someone do that to another person?" she asked me as we drove away from that interview. "How could Mom deliberately make people sick just to control them?" I didn't have a satisfying answer to her question. The level of callousness required to systematically abuse elderly people for financial gain was difficult to comprehend, even for someone who had experienced Sarah's manipulation directly. "I think some people become so focused on what they want that they stop seeing their victims as human beings," I said finally. "They convince themselves that they're helping, or that the ends justify the means, or that their victims are going to lose their money anyway, so it might as well benefit someone who can use it wisely." But even as I offered these explanations, I struggled to understand how my own daughter-in-law could have become someone capable of such systematic cruelty. The woman who had once brought me flowers on Mother's Day and had cried at Robert's funeral had somehow transformed into a predator who targeted the most vulnerable members of society. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Rodriguez discovered that Sarah had been working with accomplices. Analysis of her financial records revealed payments to several other healthcare professionals who had been referring clients to her services. These referrals weren't random. They were targeted recommendations of elderly people who fit specific vulnerability profiles. One of these accomplices was Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in treating elderly people with cognitive impairments. Dr. Hawkins had been referring patients to Sarah's care management services, particularly those who were dealing with mild memory issues or adjustment difficulties following the death of a spouse. What made these referrals suspicious was their timing and specificity. Dr. Hawkins would identify patients who had significant assets but limited family support, then recommend Sarah's services as a way to help them maintain their independence. The patients trusted these recommendations because they came from their doctor, not realizing that Dr. Hawkins was receiving payments for each successful referral. The collaboration between Sarah and Dr. Hawkins created a perfect storm for elder abuse. Dr. Hawkins would identify vulnerable victims and provide medical legitimacy for concerns about their cognitive function, while Sarah would implement the practical manipulation tactics needed to gain control of their assets. Together, they had created a pipeline of elderly victims who were systematically stripped of their autonomy and financial independence under the guise of compassionate care. The discovery of this professional network led to additional charges against Sarah and expanded the investigation to include other healthcare providers who might be involved in similar schemes. Detective Rodriguez explained that elder abuse operations often relied on legitimate professionals who could provide credibility and access to potential victims. These aren't just individual criminals, she said. They're organized networks that exploit the trust people place in healthcare providers and social services professionals. As the investigation expanded, I found myself playing an increasingly central role in helping prosecutors understand the psychological aspects of Sarah's methods. My experience as both a victim and an advocate gave me unique insights into how these manipulation schemes developed and why they were so effective. I worked with the prosecution team to develop courtroom presentations that would help jurors understand the complexity of elder abuse cases. Many people struggled to comprehend how intelligent, capable elderly people could be manipulated so thoroughly, and prosecutors needed to educate juries about the vulnerability factors and psychological techniques that made such manipulation possible. The key is helping people understand that this isn't about cognitive decline or mental weakness. I explained during one preparation session. It's about deliberate manipulation by people who are trained to exploit trust and create dependency. I also helped prosecutors prepare the elderly victims for their testimony. Many were nervous about speaking in court, worried that they would be portrayed as confused or unreliable witnesses. I worked with them to organize their thoughts, practice their testimony, and understand the importance of their role in stopping Sarah from victimizing other people. "Your voice is powerful," I told Frank before his testimony. "You have the opportunity to speak for all the elderly people who can't speak for themselves, who have been silenced by manipulation and abuse." The trial began in early autumn, nearly 2 years after Emma had first called me with concerns about Richard's treatment. Sarah was facing multiple charges including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and practicing healthcare services without proper licensing. The prosecution's strategy was to present Sarah's crimes as part of a systematic pattern rather than isolated incidents. They began with Richard's case, using Emma's testimony and documentation to establish how Sarah's manipulation techniques worked. Then they presented my case as background, showing how Sarah had developed and refined her methods over time. The most powerful testimony came from the elderly victims themselves. Frank, Betty, and 4 other former clients took the stand to describe their experiences with Sarah. Their accounts were detailed, credible, and devastating to Sarah's defense. Frank's testimony was particularly effective because of his meticulous record-keeping. He was able to provide specific dates, quotes, and documentation that contradicted Sarah's claims about their interactions. When Sarah's attorney tried to suggest that Frank's memory was unreliable, Frank pulled out his notebooks and read directly from his contemporaneous notes. "According to my notes from March 15th, Frank said clearly, "Ms. Peterson told me that I had agreed to consolidate my investment accounts, but I have no record of such a conversation. In fact, my notes from our previous meeting show that I specifically told her I wanted to keep my accounts separate." Betty's testimony about medication manipulation was equally compelling. She described the pattern of confusion that occurred only when Sarah was managing her medications, and the dramatic improvement in her mental clarity after she stopped using Sarah's services. "I'm 93 years old," Betty said with dignity, "and I've been taking medications for various conditions for over 20 years. I know the difference between age-related changes and deliberate interference with my medication regimen." The medical evidence supported Betty's testimony. Her hospital records showed normal cognitive function during periods when she was not under Sarah's care, while her symptoms of confusion coincided exactly with times when Sarah was managing her medications. Sarah's defense strategy was predictable but ineffective. Her attorney argued that she was a dedicated healthcare professional who had genuinely tried to help elderly clients manage complex medical and financial challenges. They claimed that any problems that arose were due to misunderstandings or the natural progression of age-related cognitive decline in her clients. But the evidence against Sarah was too comprehensive and consistent to be explained away as misunderstandings. The financial records showed clear patterns of exploitation. The victim testimony revealed systematic manipulation tactics, and the documentation from accomplices like Dr. Hawkins proved that Sarah's operation was deliberate and organized. The prosecution's expert witnesses provided crucial context for understanding Sarah's methods. A geriatric psychiatrist explained how manipulation tactics could create genuine confusion and disorientation in elderly victims, making them appear to have cognitive impairments they didn't actually have. A financial crimes investigator detailed the sophisticated methods Sarah had used to redirect and conceal her victims' assets. I testified as an expert witness on elder abuse patterns, explaining how Sarah's methods fit established profiles of elder exploitation. I also testified about my personal experience, describing the psychological impact of her manipulation and the long-term effects on victims' trust and self-confidence. Elder abuse isn't just about financial loss, I explained to the jury. It's about the systematic destruction of a person's autonomy, dignity, and sense of reality. The victims lose more than their money. They lose their confidence in their own judgment and their faith in the people they trusted to care for them. During cross-examination, Sarah's attorney tried to portray me as someone motivated by personal vendetta rather than genuine concern for other victims, but my work with the State Attorney General's office and my documented advocacy for numerous other elder abuse victims undermine this characterization. Mrs. Peterson, the prosecutor asked during redirect examination, how many elder abuse cases have you been involved with since your own experience with the defendant? Over 300, I replied. I've worked with victims across multiple states, helping them understand their rights and access legal resources. And in how many of those cases were you personally acquainted with the perpetrator? Only this one. The prosecution's closing argument was comprehensive and powerful. They systematically reviewed the evidence against Sarah, showing how her manipulation tactics had evolved from family-based abuse to professional exploitation. They emphasized the vulnerability of her victims and the calculated nature of her crimes. Sarah Peterson didn't accidentally stumble into elder abuse, the prosecutor said. She systematically developed methods for identifying, targeting, and exploiting elderly victims. She turned healthcare knowledge into weapons for manipulation, and she built a network of accomplices to help her find and abuse vulnerable seniors. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Sarah was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. Dr. Hawkins and 2 other accomplices received shorter sentences and had their professional licenses revoked. The conviction made regional news as one of the largest elder abuse cases in the state's history. The story highlighted the growing problem of professional elder exploitation and the need for better oversight of people who provided services to elderly clients. More importantly for me, the trial represented a complete vindication of everything I had experienced and everything I had worked to achieve since my children's betrayal. Sarah's conviction proved that my accusations had been accurate, that my documentation methods were effective, and that my decision to fight back had been justified. But the most meaningful aspect of the trial's outcome was the message it sent to other elderly people who might be experiencing similar abuse. The extensive media coverage included information about warning signs, resources for getting help, and encouragement for victims to trust their instincts about manipulation. Several elderly people contacted me after the trial, saying that the news coverage had helped them recognize manipulation in their own lives and given them the courage to seek help. One woman said that seeing Sarah's conviction had convinced her that she wasn't paranoid for suspecting her son of financial abuse, and she had successfully obtained legal protection from his manipulation. Emma and I continued our victim advocacy work after the trial, expanding our focus to include training for healthcare professionals and financial services workers who might encounter elder abuse in their practice. We developed workshops that taught people how to recognize signs of manipulation and provided protocols for reporting suspected abuse. I want to make sure that what happened to you and Grandpa and all those other people never happens again, Emma told me during one of our planning sessions. I want to help create a world where elderly people are protected instead of targeted. Her dedication to this work filled me with pride and hope. Emma had taken the traumatic experience of discovering her mother's criminal behavior and transformed it into a commitment to protecting other families from similar betrayal. Richard remained an active part of our extended family, joining Emma and me for holiday dinners and community events. His experience with Sarah's manipulation had been traumatic, but his successful fight against her abuse had given him a sense of empowerment that carried over into other aspects of his life. I never thought I'd be grateful for anything Sarah did, he told me one evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset. But if she hadn't targeted me, I never would have gotten to know you and Emma the way I have. I never would have learned how strong I could be when I needed to protect myself. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which my own children had been involved in Sarah's broader operation. David had provided accounting services for some of her shell companies, and Michael had helped her create fraudulent business documents. They faced additional charges related to their support of Sarah's criminal enterprise. This discovery brought me a strange sense of closure. For years I had wondered if my children's betrayal had been an aberration, a temporary lapse in judgment driven by grief and financial pressure. Learning that they had continued their involvement in elder abuse through Sarah's operation confirmed that their manipulation of me had not been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of callousness toward elderly people. I felt sad for the people they had become, but I no longer felt any guilt about the consequences they faced. They had made deliberate choices to harm vulnerable people for financial gain, and they deserved to face the legal and social consequences of those choices. As winter approached, I reflected on the remarkable journey my life had taken since that morning, when I found the birthday card with Ellis's handwriting. The discovery of my husband's deception had shattered my understanding of my own life, but it had also begun a process of growth and transformation that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. I had learned to trust my own perceptions, even when they contradicted what other people told me was true. I had developed skills in investigation and documentation that proved invaluable in protecting myself and others. Most importantly, I had discovered a sense of purpose and meaning that came from using my painful experiences to help other people. The woman who had once doubted her own memory and questioned her own worth had become someone who helped other elderly people recognize their strength and protect their autonomy. The victim of elder abuse had become an expert advocate whose knowledge was sought by law enforcement agencies and legal professionals across multiple states. My house remained the peaceful sanctuary I had fought to keep, but it was no longer a place of isolation and grief. Emma visited regularly, often bringing friends from her college advocacy group who were interested in learning about elder abuse prevention. Richard stopped by for weekly dinners, and Helen continued to be my closest friend and confidant. The garden where I had once sat in despair, questioning my own sanity, had become a place where I planned new projects and reflected on the positive impact I was having on other people's lives. The basement where I had discovered evidence of Ellis's betrayal had been transformed into an office where I developed training materials and victim support resources. Most remarkably, the little recording devices that had once been tools of desperate self-defense had evolved into symbols of empowerment for elderly people facing manipulation and abuse. I included information about documentation techniques in all my presentations, encouraging elderly people to trust their instincts and gather evidence when something felt wrong. Your own voice and your own observations are more powerful than you realize, I would tell audiences. Don't let anyone convince you that your perceptions are wrong or that your concerns are invalid. You have the right to question what's happening in your own life, and you have the power to protect yourself. The message resonated because it came from someone who had lived through the experience and emerged stronger. I wasn't offering theoretical advice or academic insights. I was sharing hard-won wisdom from someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be gaslit, manipulated, and betrayed by the people who were supposed to love and protect her. As I prepared for bed on the anniversary of Sarah's conviction, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected paths my life had taken. I had not chosen to become an expert in elder abuse, but I had embraced that role with determination and purpose. I had not planned to become estranged from my own children, but I had used that painful experience to build stronger relationships with people who shared my values and respected my worth. The tiny red light that had once blinked in my pill organizer, capturing evidence of my children's betrayal, had started a chain of events that led to justice for dozens of elderly victims and protection for countless others who might have been targeted in the future. What began as a desperate attempt to document my own reality had become a powerful tool for social change and victim advocacy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to help elderly people protect themselves from manipulation and abuse. I would continue developing educational programs, training law enforcement officers, and advocating for stronger legal protections for vulnerable adults. But tonight, I was simply a 74-year-old woman who had faced betrayal from multiple sources and had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. I had learned that survival was not enough, that healing required purpose, and that the most meaningful victories came from using our own pain to prevent others from suffering in the same ways. The war that began with a forged birthday card had ended with justice, healing, and the knowledge that my voice would continue to protect people long after my own story was over. 5 years had passed since Sarah's conviction, and my life had settled into a rhythm that felt both purposeful and peaceful. The woman who had once questioned her own sanity while fighting her children's manipulation had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights, but more importantly, I had found deep contentment in the simple act of helping others reclaim their voices. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window as I prepared for what would be my final official presentation as a state advisor. At 78, I had decided it was time to step back from the demanding travel schedule and intensive casework that had defined my advocacy years. My retirement from the state position would be effective at the end of the month, though I planned to continue mentoring other advocates and providing consultation on complex cases. Emma, now 27 and a licensed social worker specializing in elder advocacy, would be taking over many of my responsibilities. She had grown into a formidable advocate in her own right, combining her natural compassion with the investigative skills I had taught her and the legal knowledge she had gained through her graduate studies. "Are you sure you're ready to retire, Grandma Marge?" she asked as she arrived with coffee and pastries for our pre-presentation breakfast. "You seem more energized by this work than ever." I smiled at her concern. Emma still worried that I might be making decisions based on what other people expected of me rather than what I truly wanted. A sensitivity that had developed from watching her mother manipulate so many elderly people into choices that weren't in their best interests. "I'm not retiring from the work," I clarified. "I'm just changing how I do it. There's a difference between stepping back from official responsibilities and abandoning something you care about." The presentation that morning was for a national conference of elder law attorneys, social workers, and law enforcement officials. I would be sharing 5 years of data about elder abuse prevention programs and discussing the most effective strategies for identifying and prosecuting financial exploitation cases. But what I was most excited to share was the success story that had emerged from our victim advocacy program. Over the past 5 years, we had helped over 800 elderly people recognize and escape manipulation situations. More importantly, we had prevented countless cases of abuse by educating families, healthcare providers, and financial services professionals about warning signs and intervention strategies. The ripple effects of Sarah's prosecution had extended far beyond her immediate victims. The media coverage of her case had inspired other elderly people to come forward with their own experiences of manipulation, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. Several states had strengthened their elder abuse laws, and professional organizations had implemented new oversight requirements for people providing services to elderly clients. As I stood before the audience of 300 professionals that morning, I felt the weight of representing not just my own experience, but the voices of hundreds of elderly people who had found the courage to speak up about abuse. The shy, uncertain woman who had once been afraid to contradict her own children had evolved into someone comfortable commanding the attention of experts and officials. When I first started recording my children's conversations 5 years ago, I was simply trying to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, I began. I had no idea that those recordings would become evidence in a case that would expose a multi-state elder abuse operation and lead to the conviction of 15 perpetrators. I shared the key insights we had gained from our prevention work, emphasizing the importance of education, early intervention, and victim empowerment. But I also talked about the personal transformation that could occur when elderly people were given the tools and support to protect themselves. Elder abuse is not just about financial loss or physical harm, I explained. It's about the systematic destruction of a person's sense of agency and self-worth. The most important thing we can do for victims is help them rediscover their own power and trust their own judgment. After the presentation, I was approached by a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Linda Chen, a geriatrician from Oregon. She had been following my work for several years and had implemented elder abuse screening protocols in her practice based on my recommendations. "Mrs. Peterson, I wanted to thank you for the impact your work has had on my practice," she said. "Last month, I identified signs of financial manipulation in one of my patients using the screening questions you developed. We were able to intervene before she lost her home, and she's now safely living independently with appropriate support services." These types of interactions had become common over the years, but they never lost their power to move me. Each successful intervention represented someone's grandmother or grandfather who would retain their dignity, independence, and financial security because we had learned to recognize and respond to manipulation tactics. Dr. Chen's comment also reminded me of one of the most meaningful developments in my advocacy work. The screening protocols we had developed were now being used in medical practices, financial institutions, and social services agencies across the country. Healthcare providers who might never have recognized signs of elder abuse were now trained to identify manipulation tactics and connect victims with appropriate resources. The conference concluded with a panel discussion about future directions in elder abuse prevention. I participated alongside law enforcement officials, legal experts, and other advocates, but I found myself focusing less on policy recommendations and more on the human elements of the work. The most important thing we can do is listen to elderly people when they tell us something feels wrong, I said during the panel. Too often we dismiss their concerns as confusion or paranoia, when they're actually recognizing manipulation that we haven't learned to see yet. As I flew home that afternoon, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had once sat in her garden questioning her own perceptions had just delivered a presentation to national experts about trusting elderly people's instincts and empowering them to protect themselves. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been moments of self-doubt, periods of grief for the family relationships I had lost, and times when the weight of other people's trauma felt overwhelming. But there had also been profound satisfaction in knowing that my painful experiences had prevented others from suffering in similar ways. Emma met me at the airport, and we drove home together through the familiar streets of the neighborhood where I had lived for nearly 50 years. The house looked the same from the outside, but inside it had been transformed into something that felt both deeply personal and purposefully professional. Robert's old office had become my advocacy workspace, filled with case files, research materials, and correspondence from victims and their families. The guest bedroom had been converted into a meeting space where I conducted video consultations with elderly people who couldn't travel to see me in person. Even the basement, once a place of painful discovery, had been transformed into a resource library where Emma and other young advocates could access training materials and reference documents. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," Emma said as we sat in the kitchen sharing a late dinner. "About not retiring from the work, just changing how you do it. I think I understand what you mean now." "What do you think I mean?" "I think you're ready to focus on the parts of this work that bring you the most joy and meaning, rather than feeling obligated to say yes to every request or opportunity." She was right. Over the years, I had gradually taken on more responsibilities and commitments than I could sustainably manage. The travel schedule, the constant phone calls from victims in crisis, and the emotional weight of processing hundreds of abuse cases had begun to feel overwhelming rather than energizing. But there were aspects of the work that still filled me with purpose and excitement. I loved mentoring new advocates, helping them develop the skills and confidence they needed to support elderly victims. I enjoyed developing educational materials that could help people recognize manipulation before it escalated to serious abuse. Most of all, I treasured the opportunities to connect directly with elderly people who were struggling to trust their own perceptions about concerning family dynamics. "I want to focus on the work that only I can do," I told Emma, "the things that require my specific experience and perspective, rather than trying to be everything to everyone." This decision felt liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For the past 5 years, I had been driven by a sense of urgency about preventing elder abuse, feeling personally responsible for protecting every vulnerable elderly person I encountered. But I was beginning to understand that sustainable advocacy required recognizing my own limitations and focusing my energy where it could have the greatest impact. The following week, I received a phone call that crystallized my feelings about the direction I wanted my work to take. The caller was a woman named Patricia Williams, an 81-year-old retired teacher from North Carolina who had heard about my work through a magazine article. "Mrs. Peterson, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly," she began, "but I'm in a situation that reminds me of what I read about your experience, and I don't know who else to turn to." Patricia's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Her son had recently moved back home after a divorce, and he had gradually begun taking control of her finances and daily activities. He was using classic manipulation tactics, questioning her memory, creating evidence of her supposed confusion, and isolating her from friends who might question his behavior. "I feel like I'm going crazy," Patricia said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Everyone tells me I should be grateful that my son is taking such good care of me, but I feel like I'm losing myself." I spent over an hour on the phone with Patricia, helping her understand what she was experiencing and providing her with specific strategies for documenting the manipulation and protecting her assets. But more importantly, I listened to her story with the kind of validation and belief that I remembered desperately needing during my own ordeal. "Patricia, you are not going crazy," I told her firmly. "You are recognizing manipulation tactics that are designed to make you doubt your own perceptions. Your instincts are correct, and you have every right to protect yourself." By the end of our conversation, Patricia sounded stronger and more confident. She had a plan for documenting her son's behavior, contact information for local resources, and most importantly, the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her experience. "Thank you for believing me," she said before we hung up. "You're the first person who has listened to my concerns without making me feel like I'm being paranoid or ungrateful." After that call, I knew exactly how I wanted to spend my retirement years. I wanted to be available for people like Patricia, elderly individuals who were in the early stages of recognizing manipulation and needed someone who understood their experience to help them trust their own judgment. I began transitioning away from my official responsibilities, referring most requests for presentations and consultations to Emma and other advocates I had trained. But I maintained a private practice focused specifically on providing support and guidance to elderly people who were experiencing family-based manipulation. This work felt more personal and meaningful than anything I had done during my years as a state advisor. Each conversation was an opportunity to provide the kind of validation and support I had needed during my own crisis, and each successful intervention represented someone's retained independence and dignity. The irony wasn't lost on me that the skills I had developed while fighting my own children's manipulation had become my greatest professional asset. The careful documentation techniques, the ability to recognize gaslighting patterns, and the knowledge of legal protections that I had acquired out of desperation were now helping other elderly people navigate similar challenges with confidence and strategic thinking. Richard, now 87, remained an active part of my life and occasionally joined me for speaking engagements where his perspective as a male victim provided important insights for audiences. His successful resistance to Sarah's manipulation had given him a sense of empowerment that extended to other areas of his life, and he had become a passionate advocate for elderly men who might be experiencing abuse. Most people think elder abuse is primarily a problem for elderly women, he would tell audiences, but men can be just as vulnerable to manipulation, especially when it comes from family members who exploit our desire to be helpful and accommodating. Together, Richard and I had developed educational materials specifically focused on helping elderly men recognize and respond to financial manipulation. We had learned that many men were reluctant to seek help for abuse because they felt embarrassed about being victimized or because they didn't want to admit that family members were taking advantage of them. On a warm spring evening, as I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and watched the sunset through the trees Robert had planted so many years ago, I reflected on the unexpected ways that trauma and healing could transform a life. The woman who had once sat in this same spot questioning her own sanity had become someone whose voice was sought by experts and whose experience provided hope for people facing similar challenges. The little recording devices that had once captured my children's betrayal were now symbols of empowerment for elderly people around the country. I included information about documentation techniques in all my consultations, encouraging people to trust their instincts and gather evidence when something felt wrong. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was the relationship I had rebuilt with the parts of my family that were worth preserving. Emma had become not just my successor in advocacy work, but my closest friend and confidant. Richard had evolved from an in-law I barely knew to a trusted collaborator and surrogate father figure. We had created a chosen family based on shared values and mutual respect, proving that meaningful relationships didn't require blood connections or legal obligations. What mattered was the willingness to see each other clearly, support each other's growth, and work together toward common goals. The phone rang, interrupting my peaceful reflection. It was another elderly person who had heard about my work and needed someone to help them understand whether their family's behavior was normal, concern, or manipulative control. As I reached for the phone, I smiled at the realization that this work would never truly end. As long as there were vulnerable elderly people and unscrupulous family members willing to exploit them, there would be a need for advocates who understood the dynamics of elder abuse and could help victims find their voices. "Hello, this is Marge," I said, settling back into my chair and preparing to listen to another story that would probably sound familiar but would require its own unique approach and solution. "How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was uncertain, frightened, but hopeful. Another elderly person was taking the first step toward protecting themselves, and I was honored to be part of that journey. The conversation that followed would be different from all the others, but it would also be remarkably similar. Another opportunity to help someone rediscover their own strength and trust their own perceptions. As darkness fell over my garden and the conversation continued, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path my life had taken. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had become the foundation for work that brought meaning and purpose to my days. The pain that had once felt unbearable had been transformed into a source of strength and wisdom that could help other people navigate their own difficult journeys. The war that began with a birthday card had ended not with victory over my enemies, but with the discovery of my own power and the commitment to using that power in service of others who needed it most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.